The letter showed up the same morning the doctor told me my father probably wouldn't make it through the week. I was sitting in a plastic chair in the ICU waiting room, holding a cup of coffee I hadn't touched in an hour, staring at the floor tiles like they might suddenly explain life to me, when my phone buzzed. It was my neighbor. She said, "Claire, something came in your mailbox. It looks official." At the time I figured it was another hospital bill or maybe insurance paperwork. When your parents are both sick at the same time, envelopes stop feeling like mail and start feeling like threats. But this one was different. When she read the first line out loud, I remember feeling this strange, hollow pause in my chest. Notice of violation. Pine Ridge Homeowners Association. Fine of $9,200. Property must be vacated within 14 days. I actually laughed. Not because it was funny, more because it was so absurd it didn't feel real. 14 days. While my father was dying 2 floors above me. While my mother was hooked to oxygen down the hall. And the house they were talking about, the one they were threatening to take. That house had been in my family since 1952. My name is Claire Donnelly. I'm 31 years old, and at the time this happened I was a captain in the United States Air Force working as a military prosecutor. But the HOA board in my neighborhood didn't know that. All they knew was that my parents were sick. The house looked old compared to the new developments popping up around it. And some developer had been sniffing around the neighborhood offering cash for properties. Which meant they saw an opportunity. And like a lot of people who get a little bit of power in a quiet suburban neighborhood, they decided to push. The house itself wasn't fancy. Never had been. My grandfather built it with his own hands after coming home from the Korean War. Small cedar siding, crooked front porch, a massive oak tree in the yard that had probably been there longer than the town itself. 3 generations grew up under that roof. My dad learned to ride a bike in that driveway. I learned to climb that oak tree before I could spell my own last name. Every Thanksgiving we crammed 15 people into a dining room meant for 8, and my grandmother would say the same thing every year. House gets smaller, family gets bigger. She passed away a long time ago, but the house stayed. And apparently that had started bothering someone. Later that afternoon, I finally opened the actual letter my neighbor had left at the hospital front desk. It was printed on thick paper like someone really wanted it to look official. Violation of community standards. Unapproved property structure. Failure to comply with neighborhood architectural regulations. $9,200 fine. Vacate property within 14 days or face legal enforcement. I read it twice, then 3 times. And the more I read it, the stranger it felt. Because there was one detail that immediately jumped out. The Pine Ridge Homeowners Association had been created in 1987. Our house was built in 1952, which meant one very simple thing. They had no authority over it. Legally speaking, you can't retroactively force a property into an HOA covenant unless the owner signs onto it. And my grandfather was the kind of stubborn old soldier who didn't sign things he didn't agree with. Which meant that letter wasn't just aggressive. It was wrong. I stepped outside into the hospital parking lot and called the number listed at the bottom. It rang twice. Then a man answered. Calm voice. Smooth. The kind of voice people use when they think they're in charge. Pine Ridge Homeowners Association. This is Mark Halverson speaking. I leaned against my car and said, Hi Mark. My name is Claire Donnelly. I just received a notice saying my family has 14 days to vacate our home. There was a pause. Paper shuffling on the other end. Then he said, almost casually, Yes, that's correct. No hesitation. No apology. Just confirmation. I took a breath. Mark, that house was built 35 years before your HOA even existed. My grandfather built it himself. Another pause. Then he chuckled. Not loudly. Just enough to let me know he thought the conversation was already over. Well, he said, the community has standards now. I felt my jaw tighten. I'm currently at the hospital with both of my parents in critical care. Silence for a moment. Then he said something I still remember word for word. Miss Donnelly, everyone has problems. The rules still apply. That was the moment the tone shifted. Because I'd spent the last 3 weeks watching doctors run machines around my father's bed while my mother tried to breathe through tubes. I was tired. I was scared. And suddenly this guy was talking to me about community standards. I said slowly, Your HOA doesn't have jurisdiction over that property. He didn't miss a beat. Then you're welcome to challenge it in court. Click. He hung up. I stood there for a long moment in the parking lot staring at my phone. Then I walked back inside, rode the elevator up to the ICU, sat next to my dad's bed, and for the next hour, I didn't think about the letter at all. Some things matter more. But later that night, around midnight, when the hospital got quiet and the vending machines were the only sound in the hallway, I opened my laptop in the cafeteria. Just out of curiosity, I pulled the county property records. Original deed, 1952. Owner, Thomas Donnelly. My grandfather. Then I pulled the HOA incorporation filing. Exactly like I thought. But while I was digging through the county database, something else caught my attention. There had been a property transfer nearby 2 months earlier. A development company called Redwood Land Group had quietly purchased 3 houses on the same street. All 3 were older homes. All 3 had been owned by elderly couples. And all 3 had been demolished within weeks. That alone might have been coincidence. Except one more document popped up while I was searching. A campaign donation record. $25,000. From Redwood Land Group. Donated to a local neighborhood improvement committee. Guess who chaired that committee? Mark Halverson. And that's when I felt that slow, familiar feeling settle in my chest. The one prosecutors get when something starts to smell like a crime. Because suddenly the HOA letter didn't look like neighborhood enforcement anymore. It looked like pressure. And pressure, used the right way, can become fraud real fast. I leaned back in the cafeteria chair and stared at the screen. My father was upstairs fighting to breathe. My mother was asleep with a monitor attached to her heart. And some HOA president thought he could bully our family out of a 70-year-old house while we were distracted. I remember smiling a little to myself. Because Mark Halverson had made one very specific mistake. He thought he was dealing with a grieving daughter. He had no idea he'd just picked a legal fight with someone who prosecuted federal crimes for a living. And once that thought crossed my mind, I started digging. Once that thought settled in my head, I did what prosecutors do when something doesn't smell right. I started following the paper trail. Now, if you've never gone digging through public records at 2 in the morning in a hospital cafeteria, let me tell you, it's a strange kind of quiet. The kind where every click of a keyboard feels louder than it should. Nurses walking past with coffee, machines humming down the hall, and you sitting there with your laptop slowly pulling threads that someone somewhere hoped nobody would ever notice. At first I told myself I was just checking the basics. Property covenants, zoning filings, HOA authority boundaries, things I'd seen 1,000 times before. But the deeper I went, the stranger it got. Because Pine Ridge HOA had been pretty quiet for decades. No lawsuits, no major fines, nothing dramatic. Then suddenly, in the past year, enforcement had exploded. 5 houses cited. 4 of them owned by people over 70. 2 had already sold. 1 had moved out. And the last one was us. I leaned back in my chair and rubbed my eyes. That's not a coincidence. That's a pattern. And patterns are what make prosecutors start asking harder questions. So I opened another tab and searched Redwood Land Group. At first glance, they looked like any other small development company. Clean website. Stock photos of happy families standing in front of identical houses. Phrases like community revitalization and modern living solutions. But corporate filings tell a more honest story than websites. Redwood had been buying land aggressively in our county for about 18 months. Mostly older properties. Mostly ones sitting on larger lots. And almost all of them in neighborhoods that had recently formed HOAs. Or strengthened existing ones. I felt my stomach tighten a little. Because if you've ever worked in law enforcement long enough, you learn that corruption rarely starts big. It starts with something small. A shortcut. A favor. A quiet conversation at a dinner meeting. And then it grows. I went back to the HOA records. Minutes from board meetings are public. Most people never read them. Which is exactly why people who are doing shady things love hiding inside them. The first thing I noticed was how often Mark Halverson's name appeared. He wasn't just the HOA president. He chaired the compliance committee, the development review committee, and that neighborhood improvement group I'd seen earlier, which meant he controlled almost every decision about property enforcement. Then I found something interesting. A meeting 6 months earlier. Agenda item number 4. Discussion of legacy properties not conforming to updated community standards. Legacy properties. That's a polite way of saying old houses. The meeting notes were short. Too short. But one line stood out. Board agreed enforcement measures should be applied consistently moving forward. Consistently. Funny word. Because in the 6 months after that meeting, enforcement had only targeted 5 homes. And every single one sat on land large enough for redevelopment. That's when I opened another window and searched Redwood Land Group financial disclosures again. This time I looked deeper. Campaign donations, community grants, consulting payments. And there it was, $48,000, paid to a consulting firm called Halverson Community Planning. I stared at the screen for a second. Then I leaned forward. Halverson. Same last name. Same county. Sure enough, 2 clicks later the business registration popped up. Owner, Mark Halverson, which meant the president of the HOA enforcing fines against older homeowners, was receiving money connected to the development company buying those homes. Now, technically speaking, none of that was illegal by itself. But in federal court, we called it the beginning of a very uncomfortable story. I checked the payment date. 2 months before our violation letter. That's when the puzzle pieces really started sliding into place. Because suddenly I could see the strategy. Step 1. Identify older homes on larger lots. Step 2. Use HOA compliance enforcement to pressure owners. Step 3. Create financial stress with fines and legal threats. Step 4. Developer steps in with a reasonable purchase offer. And if the homeowner is elderly or distracted or grieving, well, that house suddenly becomes a lot easier to acquire. I closed my laptop for a moment and sat there thinking. Part of me wanted to walk upstairs, sit by my dad, and forget the whole thing. Life was already heavy enough. But the other part of my brain, the part that had spent years building cases against people who thought they were clever, that part wasn't going to let it go. So I opened the laptop again. If Mark Halverson wanted to play this game, he had picked the wrong week. Because I had time. Hospitals create a lot of waiting. And waiting gives you space to work. The next step was verifying jurisdiction. If the HOA didn't legally control our property, then the violation notice wasn't just harassment. It could qualify as attempted fraud, especially if financial pressure was involved. So I downloaded the full HOA covenant documents. 53 pages. Dense legal language. Restrictions about fences, roofing materials, mailbox design, landscaping heights. The usual suburban battlefield stuff. But buried in Section 12 was the important line. Properties constructed prior to the establishment of the association shall not be bound by these covenants unless voluntarily annexed by written agreement. I checked county filings again. No annexation. No signatures. Nothing. Which meant Mark Halverson already knew our property wasn't under HOA control. He had sent the violation letter anyway. Now things were getting interesting. Because intent matters. If someone knowingly uses a false claim to pressure a property owner into paying money, that can cross into fraud. And if mail is used to send the notice, that becomes mail fraud, which, for those who don't spend their lives in courtrooms, is a federal offense. I sat there staring at the screen and let out a slow breath. This wasn't just neighborhood drama anymore. This was starting to look like a real case. Right around that time, my phone buzzed again. It was my neighbor, Linda. She'd lived across the street for 30 years and treated our family like extended relatives. Claire, she said quietly, there was a man taking pictures of your house today. My stomach dropped. What kind of man? Suit. Clipboard. Looked official. I closed my eyes for a second. Redwood. They were already preparing. Which meant Mark Halverson probably thought the pressure letter would scare us into negotiating quickly. Maybe he figured we'd sell cheap to avoid legal trouble. Maybe he assumed we were too busy dealing with hospital bills to fight back. People like that rely on timing. They move when families are vulnerable, when attention is somewhere else. What he didn't realize was that while he was sending violation letters, I was building a case file. And by 2 in the morning that night, the cafeteria table looked like a war map. Documents printed, notes written in the margins, property maps open on the laptop screen. I had financial connections between Halverson and Redwood. A violation notice sent to a property outside HOA authority. Evidence of selective enforcement against older homeowners. That's not proof of a crime yet, but it's enough to make federal investigators curious. Which brings me to something most people don't know about prosecutors. We don't need to prove the entire case before we call the FBI. We just need enough evidence to show something worth investigating. I checked the time. 2:17 a.m. Then I opened a blank document. Title line. Criminal referral. I started writing. By the time the cafeteria lights flickered for overnight cleaning, 3 documents were finished. First was the referral packet outlining potential mail fraud and bribery. Second was a civil complaint challenging the HOA violation and requesting immediate dismissal. Third was a motion for emergency injunction preventing any enforcement action against our property. Every document included the evidence I collected: bank records, HOA meeting notes, property covenants, financial links to Redwood. When I finally leaned back in the chair, my coffee had gone completely cold, but the case file looked solid. I saved everything, closed the laptop, and sat there for a minute just listening to the quiet. Somewhere upstairs, my dad's heart monitor was still ticking, and for a moment, all the legal stuff faded again. Because no lawsuit in the world changes the fact that people you love eventually leave. But something my grandfather used to say came back to me right then. He'd sit on that crooked front porch, watching the neighborhood kids ride bikes down the street, and he'd say, "Claire, some people build houses." Then he'd tap the porch rail and smile. "Other people defend them." I think that was the moment I decided I wasn't letting this go. Monday morning, those documents were going out. And when Mark Halverson opened his front door that week, he wasn't going to see another HOA complaint. He was going to see federal agents. Monday morning came faster than I expected. Hospitals have a strange way of bending time. Nights feel endless, but mornings arrive all at once, fluorescent lights flicking on, nurses changing shifts, coffee carts rolling down quiet hallways. I'd slept maybe an hour in a chair. The case file sat in my laptop bag like a brick. Around 7:30, I walked down to the hospital lobby, found a quiet corner near the windows, opened my laptop again, and read through everything one more time. Not as Claire the daughter, as Claire the prosecutor. Every claim needed to hold up. Every document had to be clean. If federal agents were going to take a look at this, the last thing I wanted was sloppy work. The evidence was simple but solid. The HOA had no legal authority over our property. Mark Halverson knew that. He sent a violation letter anyway, demanding money and threatening removal. At the same time, he was receiving payments connected to a development company buying nearby homes. Pressure plus financial interest. That combination gets investigators' attention real fast. I sent the referral packet to a contact I'd worked with before at the regional FBI office. Then I sent the civil complaint and injunction motion through the county filing system. And just like that, the first move was made. The funny thing about legal fights is that the loud part usually happens later. The beginning is quiet. Just paperwork, emails, digital filings sliding into government databases. No drama, no shouting, just a slow machine starting to turn. After that, I went upstairs and sat beside my father's bed. He was asleep most of the morning. The machines did most of the talking. Around noon, he woke up long enough to squeeze my hand. My dad was a mechanic his whole life. Not a complicated man. He looked at me and said, "You look like you're planning something." I laughed a little. "Just dealing with paperwork." He nodded slowly, like he understood more than I'd said. Then he fell asleep again. 2 days passed. I barely thought about Mark Halverson during that time. Hospitals make everything outside feel distant. But Wednesday morning my phone rang. Unknown number. I stepped out into the hallway and answered. "Claire Donnelly?" "Yes." "This is Special Agent Daniel Ruiz with the FBI. I smiled a little. "That didn't take long. We reviewed the material you sent," he said. "You mind if I ask a few questions?" We talked for about 20 minutes. He asked about the property timeline, the HOA structure, what I knew about Redwood Land Group. Standard stuff. At the end, he paused and said something that told me exactly where things were headed. "Did you send the violation notice through the mail?" I said yes. "Certified." He exhaled softly. "Good." That one word meant they already saw what I saw. Mail fraud. Federal jurisdiction. Before hanging up, he said, "We'll take a look." That's agent language for "we're already moving." Now here's the thing about federal investigations. They don't move fast all the time. But when the evidence is clean and the paperwork is simple, sometimes they move very fast. Friday morning, around 9:30, my neighbor Linda called again. Her voice sounded half shocked, half delighted. "Claire, there are 4 black SUVs parked outside Mark Halverson's house." I stood up from the chair so fast it scraped the hospital floor. "What?" "FBI jackets," she said. "They just knocked on his door." I walked to the window of the hallway and stared out at the parking lot for a second. Then I sat back down slowly, because the image formed in my mind immediately. Mark Halverson opening his front door expecting maybe a delivery, and instead seeing federal agents standing on his porch. Linda stayed on the phone giving play-by-play like it was neighborhood theater. "They're carrying boxes." Pause. "Oh wow, they're going inside." 2 hours later they walked out again, still carrying boxes. "Computers." File folders. The kind of evidence collection you only see when investigators already believe something real is there. That afternoon, my phone rang again. Same agent. Claire, Ruiz said, "We've identified several financial transfers between Halverson and Redwood Land Group. Your documentation helped connect the timeline." Translation. The thread I pulled had opened the door. Now the bigger investigation had begun. Things escalated quickly after that. Federal prosecutors started building charges. Mail fraud, wire fraud, bribery, conspiracy to deprive property rights. It turns out Mark Halverson's little HOA pressure campaign had been running longer than anyone realized. For other homeowners had received similar violation letters. 2 had already sold their homes under financial pressure. And once investigators started digging through those seized boxes, the email trail was ugly. Conversations between Halverson and Redwood executives. Strategies about which houses were most vulnerable. Discussions about elderly residents. One message literally said, "The Donnelly property might fold quickly. Family medical situation." When Agent Ruiz read that line to me over the phone, I just sat there quietly for a second. Because hearing someone talk about your parents like that, it does something to you. But the law has a way of answering that kind of thing. Legal math adds up fast. Defense attorneys. Court filings. Asset freezes. By the time the formal charges were filed, Halverson was staring at a financial avalanche. Rough estimate from the court filings looked like this. Around $200,000 in legal defense costs. $300,000 in restitution claims from affected homeowners. Federal penalties that could seize his retirement accounts. And that was before sentencing. 14 days after that original violation letter arrived at our house, my phone rang again. This time it was the new HOA president, a nervous-sounding guy named Greg. "Miss Donnelly," he said quickly, "the board would like to formally apologize." Apparently Mark Halverson had resigned. The violation notice was withdrawn, all fines erased, and they were offering a settlement agreement acknowledging our property was never under HOA jurisdiction. I didn't say anything for a few seconds. Just let the silence stretch. Then I said calmly, "Put it in writing. Notarized." He cleared his throat. "Of course." "And Greg?" "Yes. If the HOA ever sends another letter to my family." I paused. "I'll add the entire board to the lawsuit." He said, "Understood," so fast it almost overlapped my sentence. The agreement arrived the same day. Signed. Stamped. Official. But the story didn't really end there. 18 months later, Mark Halverson stood in federal court and received a 24-month prison sentence. Fraud charges stick when you build the case right. The judge said something during sentencing that stayed with me. Positions of community trust are not tools for personal profit. Simple sentence. Hard lesson. A few weeks after that, I drove past Halverson's old house on my way back from the grocery store. For sale sign in the yard. Windows empty. The place looked smaller somehow. Funny how that works. Our house, though, still stood exactly the same. The crooked porch. The big oak tree. The old cedar siding my grandfather nailed together 70 years ago. Inside, on the mantel, sits his bronze star medal, next to a folded American flag from his funeral. My father passed away 3 weeks after that HOA letter first arrived. My mother followed 2 months later. They never saw the FBI show up at Mark Halverson's door. But I did. And sometimes when I sit on that porch in the evening, I think about what my grandfather used to say. Some people build houses. Other people defend them. Now I'm curious about something. Have any of you ever dealt with an HOA that tried to push things too far? Did they actually protect the neighborhood? Or just act like they owned it? Drop your story in the comments. Because honestly, some of the worst neighborhood battles happen behind perfectly trimmed hedges. And after everything that happened with ours, I'd really like to know whose side you'd take in this one.